Well, it's fairly scholarly consensus that the canon of the New Testament was closed in the 4th century. Most will point to perhaps the Council of Carthage or Athanasius' 39th Festal Letter, both in the late 4th century, as indicators of the closed canon. Especially if you're part of the historical critical method of understanding the canon, it's something that happened almost out of accident or a historical necessity. The church needed to limit and restrict the books that it would allow in, and in a sense it closed the canon at the same time or in the same process that it formalized the canon. But when we do that, as Christians, the New Testament canon becomes a human affair, primarily human and nothing else. And when we do that, we make a mistake by forgetting that the canon itself exists as part of God's redemptive covenant with his people. In a sense, it is God's redemptive historical plan given through the apostles. So if we remember that, if we remind ourselves of what the canon is, that it is part of the church, and there is a human element in it, not to take that away from the historical critical method, but it is not only a human element. There is not only a human affair with the New Testament canon, but that it is part of a redemptive covenant and part of a divine message of God. Then we actually have to go back and reassess what we mean by closed. What do we mean when we say the canon is closed? And what you find is that if the message of the New Testament canon is God's redemptive historical plan through the apostles, then that plan ends and closes when the apostles end and close. So at the time of their last writing, or the last writing that bore apostolic testimony or apostolic witness, that would be the formal closing of the canon. You might even say at the last writing of what we would call the last New Testament book. Arguably, that would be in the end of the 1st century. Now, if that's the case, we would expect to see something of this testified to in the history of the church, and actually we do. And that's what makes the formal closing of the canon in the 4th century a little bit sketchy and something we really need to be careful of just affirming without challenge. You see, as early as the Muratorian fragment in the 2nd century, late 2nd century, early 3rd century, we have a canonical list that excludes the Shepherd of Hermas for the very reason that it was written at the time contemporary to the author of the Muratorian fragment. So the reason the Shepherd of Hermas is excluded from his canonical list is because it was written when the author was alive, so in the 3rd century, late 2nd century, long after the apostles. So what you see is that for the author of the Muratorian fragment, the canon was already closed. There was nothing to be added to that. This is long before Athanasius, long before any church council. We see this mirrored in a lot of the early church fathers as well. Their writings are always hesitantly written with this, usually with the sense that they don't want their writings to be assumed to be on par with the apostles. Why? Because they don't believe that there is anything more that can be added to what is already in existence. Irenaeus is a great example of this. In Irenaeus' writings, as far as the Gospels are concerned, he limits it to 4. There are only 4 Gospels, and it should only be 4 Gospels, according to Irenaeus. So for Irenaeus, for the Gospels at least, that part of the canon was closed at the time of his writings. That's 2nd century writing, late 2nd century writing. So we see yet again this idea that the canon was closed long before the 4th century. And something you're not going to see me say very often is I would actually agree with Bart Ehrman on this, that there was no formal proclamation that closed the canon. It was part of a widespread consensus throughout the time of the church. Now, here's where I might differ from Dr. Ehrman, is that there was no formal proclamation that closed the canon because the church cannot close the canon. The church didn't open the canon. God opened the canon, therefore the canon cannot be closed by man. So the canon was closed by God, and we would say that that would actually be at the time of the last apostolic writing. True, the rest of the church did not come to a consensus or even a majority understanding of this full canon for quite some time. But we already see by the 2nd and 3rd century, this was the canon consciousness of the church. So when did the canon close? Well, again, it depends on what you mean by closed. But I would say that the canon was closed by God at the end of the apostles, long before the 4th century. In fact, the canon of the New Testament closed at the end of the 1st century.